I'm a mild-mannered physics professor at the University of Minnesota. I created a class that was originally called Everything I Know About Science I Learned from Reading Comic Books. And in this class, we covered everything from Isaac Newton to the transistor, but there wasn't an inclined plane or pulley in sight. All the examples came from superhero comic books, and as much as possible, those cases where the superheroes got their physics right. The National Academy of Sciences and Engineering will matchmake scientists to Hollywood. And so I received a call from this woman at the National Academies, and she asked me, have you ever heard of this comic book called Watchmen? And then we spoke with Zack Snyder, and they said, yeah, why don't you come on up, and we'd like to talk to you.
So yeah, did you look around? I have some stuff in here.
I know. And
some stuff they don't have, probably. I just felt like a physical movie because it was, you know, different sort of graphic sensibility. It seemed like a different approach was needed, and that's what, I think that's what sort of led to us doing stuff like this. All right, well, good. So at 5, you're going to do the... At
5:30.
Okay, perfect.
You know, as physicists, we go to a lot of strange places, do a lot of strange things, and this has been a truly unique and fun and exciting experience, and I want to thank everyone. So, as punishment, I'm going to give you a physics talk. Well, I gave my lecture to the crew, but I also brought some PowerPoint slides of labs and classrooms. And then I also have some things of some representative data.
So that's from the 80s, that first one?
That's right.
Oh, it looks like something from the 50s.
I know. You could use it for the 50s.
That's what I would think.
They were very interested. Alex McDowell was very interested in knowing what would a lab look like in 1959? What does a physics lab look like in 1985?
And then we wanted to reconvene in about half an hour to talk specifically about Manhattan's lab and Guyler Flats.
Here we see Dr. Manhattan working on some device early on in the story. What's he doing? What would he be working on?
We're just, you know, asking the question, what's John Osterman doing?
Right.
We're going to do this later.
Is it reasonable that an intrinsic field removal chamber would look the way that it does? Alex McDowell put it, and this has always struck me, he said, we want to know what's around the corner of a long corridor, even if the audience doesn't go down that hallway.
You can get a bit of that to keep,
right,
you know, the physicists of the world happy.
Both of them.
Which are
Everybody stay calm. We'll try to keep this brief.
Clearly, people can't fly, walk through walls, run at super speed. And I don't see my job as a physics professor to just be like Professor Grump or Dr. No and say, this could never happen and this is impossible. What we do in the class is we grant each character a one-time miracle exemption from the laws of nature and say, well, if you were super strong or could stretch like a rubber band, could you run across the ocean or up the side of a building, catch bullets in midair? All things this character is shown doing, all things that are correct from a physics point of view. So you can use comic books to illustrate physics principles.
You with me? Yeah.
In Watchmen, I would say the miracle exemption is Dr. Manhattan, and basically it appears that in essence he has control of his quantum mechanical wave function. That's the notion of a miracle exemption. The intrinsic field is described by Wally Weaver in the graphic novel as everything except gravity that holds us together. If you take everything without gravity, you have electromagnetic forces, you have the strong force that holds nuclei together, you have the weak force that enables certain nuclei to decay. Those are the three components that hold atoms together. But if you could remove electromagnetic forces, there would be no reason for atoms to stick together, so all molecules would fall apart. You would be disintegrated at the most basic subatomic level. Through a miracle exemption, John Osterman is somehow able to reassemble himself. It wasn't until 1925 that Schrödinger and separately Heisenberg kind of figured out what's called modern quantum theory, which is then the foundation of everything else. Scientists that were just basically trying things to see what happened discovered fission by shooting neutrons at uranium And with the realization that the release of energy could lead to the development of an atomic weapon, quantum mechanics then suddenly got one of its first large-scale applications in the Manhattan Project. Back in the start of World War II, when scientists realized that it was possible that an atomic weapon could be developed, the United States put in a crash program to develop an atomic weapon. And scientists were, in essence, drafted into the Army. And some of the smartest people, the largest collection of Nobel laureates probably ever put together, all lived together at an Army base, worked together, and figured out how to construct and actually built the first atomic bomb. Now, all objects have a wave associated with them. We don't notice this because the larger the momentum, the smaller the wavelength. But if Doc Manhattan is able to vary his wave at will, he can do all sorts of things like stretch his wave out to some other distant location, and then he can materialize at that location. He calls it teleportation. In quantum mechanics, we call it quantum mechanical tunneling, and it goes on all the time. He can change his size at will. It's certainly not implausible if you could control your wave function that you could change your size. He has the ability to extend his wave function and presumably change some of the binding forces inside someone else's atoms. And if you mess with those binding forces, the atoms fly apart and the person explodes. This is, again, something that's in the graphic novel that is fairly realistic. The students and scientists sometimes are under a lot of pressure. And sometimes that pressure and that anxiety leads to depression. And one thing that I've noticed being an advisor to various students is you see them throw themselves into their research and throw themselves into their work because it's the one aspect of their lives that they feel they understand.
I think he goes from antipathy to apathy, where he just can't care anymore.
My red world here, now, means more to me than your blue one.
He has a vision of the world that no longer includes humans for a while.
The existence of life is a highly overrated phenomenon.
When an electron moves at a very high speed, it can actually induce a blue glow. This phenomena is called Cherenkov radiation. The speed of light is the fastest velocity in the universe in the vacuum of empty space. But light actually can travel slower than that speed when it passes through water, say, or passes through glass. And this is the source of the familiar, like, mirage effects, where if you put a pencil in a glass of water, when you look at the pencil in the water and in the air, it looks broken. And what you're seeing there is a refraction effect, an optical illusion by the refraction that at its heart results from the fact that the speed of light in water is about 3/4 what it is in air. If I send an electron at a speed greater than 3/4 the speed of light through water, it's actually now traveling faster than light can travel. What it does then is it sets up, in essence, an electromagnetic sonic boom. A little shock front is created where it sheds electromagnetic energy in the ultraviolet and blue portions of the spectrum. And what you're seeing there is the Cherenkov radiation from high-speed electrons that are coming out of these nuclei as they decay. Dr. Manhattan is constantly having to kind of hold himself together. And so there's always electrons that are leaking out, but those electrons that are leaking off give off a blue glow. And by changing the velocity of the electrons, he can change how blue he appears.
We don't have time for makeup. That blue is too light for television.
Is that dark enough?
The same blue glow from Dr. Manhattan is the blue glow you see from nuclear isotopes that decay. Not every nuclear isotope emits a high-energy electron, but some that do are, say, strontium-90 if you had access to strontium-90 and you put it in people's food or milk or cigarettes or things like that, it would get incorporated, they would get cancer. So if you were trying to frame some guy, tying it up to these high-speed electrons, these beta decay, would be a characteristic signature that would lead back to Dr. Manhattan.
You're suggesting I was the cause.
I would have to say about at least 80% of the stuff he does is legitimate as far as the one-time miracle exemption of having control of his quantum mechanical wave function.
I can change almost anything, but I can't change human nature.
Archie.
Oh, well, short for Archimedes. Merlin's pet owl. Stupid nickname.
This is the chipboard owl ship.
Yes. This one could never fly.
Never. This is the actual ship. This is how big it is. This is where they drive it from. This is how big it is inside.
It could really fly, but his miracle exemption then is the power supply.
Let's go.
The movie at least shows these jets that are shooting out and enabling the ship to hover and enabling it to fly. If I want to take an object that weighs about the size of Archimedes and lift it up over rooftops in Manhattan, I need a power, the rate of energy usage of about 4.4 megawatts just to do that and to keep that up in the air. If I were to fly from New York to Antarctica because I want to visit one of my colleagues that I think has gone rogue, I can do that, but it would use up the equivalent of just a little under 5,000 gallons of gasoline. It doesn't look like there's any place on that ship where you could store 5,000 gallons of gasoline. That's the part that requires a suspension of disbelief.
It's weird. In the Millennium Falcon, don't they push the floor?
Yeah, they do. But that's fine. They're.
You want to do
That's
a nod
fake.
to that? Or you
I want to see far, far away.
That's fake.
Wow, these rock.
They amplify the spectral range.
It might have been a little bit science fiction-y in 1985, but by 2005, very routine. And again, quantum mechanics.
You can see me, right?
I can see everything.
Night Owl, again, a little bit ahead of the curve in 1985. Kind of boring by now, because eventually we all catch up. But that exactly requires no suspension of disbelief, no miracle exemption. A bullet leaves a gun at a velocity roughly the speed of sound or so. That crack you hear from a rifle shot is actually a little sonic boom as the bullet passes overhead and is moving faster than the speed of sound. To stop that projectile that's going, say, 600, 700 miles per hour in a short time, even if he kind of, lets it recoil a bit in his body and things, I doubt I could see how he's able to do that. But there again, that's one of those cases where even he wasn't sure it was going to work.
Tell me, what do you see?
Rorschach's mask, it appears to consist of two immiscible fluids like oil and water that are buoyancy matched, such like in a lava lamp. So you have these two fluids, they don't mix, they don't wet each other, so they stay phase separated. And they're roughly buoyancy matched, so slight changes in his facial heat, perspiration, or if he gets flush, will warm up slightly the mask and change and induce, like in a lava lamp, induce the patterns to change. Though I would have to say that the particular patterns don't necessarily reflect his emotional state, they just are random patterns. There might be some phrase for people looking at a random pattern of black and white splotches and somehow inducing psychological meaning out of it, but I don't know what you would call that. Well, certainly these grappling guns exist. A lot of it is just a question of conservation of energy. You are going to shoot a projectile and you want it to leave your gun with enough velocity that it can go up 40 stories. That's pretty high, and that requires an initial muzzle velocity of about 200 feet per second, about 140 miles an hour. Well, guns shoot off their projectiles at 700 miles per hour or higher, but they're dealing with much smaller masses. So if you want to have the mass of that actual hook go up there at such a large speed, that's going to take a lot of energy. It's going to have a little bit more than just a little puff of air that's going to do it. But again, it's the kind of thing that is slightly unphysical, but not egregiously so. So, and you know, I'm not going to tell Rorschach he can't do it.
Keep your own secrets.
Even though I'm a physics professor, when I go to these movies, when I read these comic books, I don't sit there with a pad of paper and a calculator. And that's the kind of structure almost you could also see that Manhattan being very attuned to. You know, he wants his symbol to be a hydrogen atom, but a hydrogen atom does not look like, you know, the atoms don't look like this that he says. It's something more like a proton and an electron. There was a lot of things where they didn't really truly need me, because if I were to tell them that such and such a thing was physically impossible or was physically wrong, but it was what was in the graphic novel, they were going to go with the graphic novel. Because I think they were more concerned about upsetting the legions and legions of Watchmen fans rather than upsetting a physics professor from Minnesota.
It was actually while I was reading the novel that I got the call that I had gotten the project and knew that I had to do it.
Having read the graphic novel several times now, huge fan of it.
It is the Citizen Kane of graphic novels.
Like, it changed my entire life. Like, after reading that, I wanted to be a comic artist. It's the one graphic novel I tell people that don't read comics to read.
You knew right away you were in the presence not only of a masterpiece, but of a new kind of masterpiece.
It was the first book to change everything you knew about comics.
It's about the underbelly of the superhero, or the other side of the superhero, the unmasked superhero, which is what, to me, is the most exciting thing about it.
To subvert your notion of what the whole superhero story is about and kind of question why we have created these archetypes for ourselves in modern times, to crush this enterprise and maybe out of those ashes create something new and more interesting.
It was just a magnitude of different thinking and approach and conceptualization. There was something about this book that broke all the rules, but it worked. The trade paperback has continued to be one of the best selling trade paperbacks in our entire industry. The phenomenon as such carried so far that every day we sell more.
Watchmen was so groundbreaking that it caused, I was going to say, ripples of excitement throughout DC and the comic book industry, you know, of retailers and readers, but really it caused a tsunami.
It was instantly viewed as a classic, as a work of literature that was beyond its own genre.
It's won so many different unique awards. It was the first to win a Nebula Science Fiction Award.
It was the only graphic novel to win a Hugo Award. It was the only graphic novel to be on Time Magazine's top 100 English language novels of the 20th century.
You can't get away from the fact that by any imaginable aesthetic standard, Watchmen is a masterpiece. The things it talks about are universal. It understands itself as a medium, and most importantly, it reads with precisely the same devastating effect today as it did when it was first released.
We were really trying to change the face of comic books. When I came in the 70s, comics really were still considered an ephemeral medium for kids. But we really felt very strongly that the medium allowed for the most sophisticated stories, the most offbeat stories, the most independent stories. Paul Levitt said, you know, there's some great talent and great work coming out of England. And so I actually went over and had a dinner to meet and greet as many artists and writers and colorists as I could. And Alan was really one of the great lights in the comic book industry.
When you get uniquely talented people who kind of all come together at a certain point in their career, sometimes magic happens and it lasts. Gibbons and Moore were, you know, known talents, but they weren't superstars. And all of a sudden, you've taken the brakes off. You said, hey, what would you do with this idea? And then you get something like Watchmen.
When Watchmen was first mooted, it was actually going to be a story about the characters that were owned by a comics publishing company called Charlton Comics.
We thought that we would try to put Alan and the masterful artist Dave Gibbons together with the Charlton characters to try to reinvent them.
And what we realized was these superhero characters were actually archetypes. They were what you needed for a line of hero comics. There was the kind of masked character who had wonderful gadgets to fight crime with. There was the person with supernatural powers, you know, the masked vigilante type, and the femme fatale superheroine. And when we talked about ideas and what these characters could be like, there was one that wasn't pinned down. And I said to Alan, I said, oh, you know, I came up with this character when I was 14 and making up my own character called Night Owl. And Alan went, yeah, that's quite good. And I said, but it's spelled N-I-T-E-O-W-L, the American way. He went, oh, yeah, that would be perfect. So Night Owl became Watchmen. And actually, the design of the Golden Age Night Owl, the older Night Owl, Hollis Mason Night Owl, is exactly the costume that I drew on my character when I was 14. I don't know quite why I wanted him to have that particular outfit, and it was kind of a little bit like kind of Robin, Batman's Robin, with the shorts and the short sleeves on here and the domino mask and everything. And I actually unearthed the other day the drawing I did when I was 14, and you can see just how long some ideas do take to come to fruition.
The Charlton characters were the inspiration originally, but Watchmen became a thing of its own.
When you talk about where Alan Moore was and where Dave Gibbons was in their career, they had worked together previously, they knew each other well, and all of a sudden to sort of be kind of given a blank piece of paper and said, go do it.
Getting the Watchmen scripts they were essentially 22 pages of comic story. The scripts could sometimes be 135 pages long for a 22-page comic, which is unheard of. Usually a 22-page comic script would be 22 pages. Every panel was meticulous in its descriptions. A description of the room, what was on the desk, how the light was coming in through the window, what color the curtains were. Every single aspect, as if he was describing a photograph.
These two people coming together were very much Lennon and McCartney, an additive experience. They were so in tune with each other. They'd sit on a couch together side by side and draw on the same piece of paper about what they were thinking. Watchmen was a collaborative effort, and Alan had a lot of things nailed down. Okay, this is the story, and these are the political kind of implications. And I was kind of interested in what the day-to-day feeling of society would be. You know, things like fast foods, things like fashion, things like reading material. What would cars look like at that time? How did the costumes work? And Alan would think deeper about how did the themes work into what Dave is giving me. Like Dave put the smiley face button on the comedian because he looked so grim and so nasty, which Alan then looked at and of course ran with, making it the first issue cover and a keystone of the whole concept, really. The happy smile with the blood drop on it. It was one of those things that really grabbed you as a very visceral, iconic image. And then John Higgins, who was the colorist, and a friend of Dave's, he just literally lived a few miles away. So Dave would meet with him.
The script went to Dave. Dave analysed that, broke it down, did the storytelling from that, and then we talked.
Colorists often get left out when one's talking about a great work because so much is about the writing and the art, but the art in black and white doesn't compare to the fully colored art. And John Higgins gave real dimensionality to the ideas and the forms of Alan and Dave.
You could color it standard. Why wouldn't you color it standard? No, that wasn't enough. That wasn't good enough. Let's try something different.
In a colour sense, probably my first trip to New York in '84 probably did, sit in the back of my brain, because it really was a sense of sort of the neon pinks and the garish greens and reflections.
John came back with what many consider an outlandish palette, or an ugly palette even, but it worked. They clearly disposed of all the traditional approaches. So when Dave submitted the concept for, say, a logo that runs up the side of the cover, well, that doesn't sound like radical now, but back then it was, how would you know what the book was? And then to top it off, how would you have an illustration on the front cover that wasn't an action shot? There's not an action shot in any of those 12 original covers. That cover image is actually the first panel of the book.
It comes down to things that are absolutely invisible to the reader unless you deconstruct it. The kind of work that Dave did with setting up the 9 grid as his primary storytelling tool, how he violated it, how he stuck with it.
So we could do an issue of a comic that was symmetrical, and that had a kind of an aesthetic thrill. It wasn't necessarily important to the story that it was symmetrical, but it was to the theme of it, and it was going in a slightly different direction. Techniques that had been worked out by previous masters like Will Eisner, where you could, say, hold the camera's point of view and have characters walk past it, or follow the character through a scene across a changing background, where you could echo panel compositions, So I think what we were really kind of celebrating with Watchmen was what you could do with a comic book.
A monthly book of that quality is just unheard of.
As the pages came in, I think we were out of our minds. I don't think we were prepared for the layers, the density, the subtlety, the nuance. It was breathtaking.
There's almost nothing non-cliche you can say about your first reading of Watchmen, because it is always an incredible revelation.
A piece of literature that is at once incredibly ambitious, yet speaks to the reader on the most personal terms. At the time, I remember it really blew my mind.
It's stunning. You just see things that you can never unsee.
These guys were given the first go-ahead to say, it's okay to do a story that doesn't follow the conventions, and it's okay to do a story for older people, to do that which has not been done before. And the guys stepped in and they rewrote the rule book for purposes of that discussion.
Wow, they're really saying interesting things about ethics, they're saying interesting things about politics, they're saying interesting things about the nature of time and the nature of reality and metaphysics. And The Watchmen was the first book to introduce this aspect to comics.
I think what struck me most when I read it was as much the art as the words, the use of visual motifs, techniques that I thought were unique to film, the idea of repeating shapes, looping images.
The book reached me the way no other comic book ever had before.
One of the amazing things about Watchmen was that it woke up comics and really stared hard at them and made them look at themselves.
Really, Watchmen was a postmodern comic book. It's so self-referential to all the things that we know about comic books and superheroes.
It takes a look at itself, but it's also gives you what it's about and examines that.
It really dismantles and really looks at that genre and turns it on its ear.
Nobody knows who you are. You can give it up.
Try and have a normal life. Is that what you have now? A normal life. You really feel normal? At least I'm not the one still hiding behind a mask.
It wasn't until Watchmen came along that we really understood what a realistic treatment of the psychology of a superhero would be.
There's a tremendous exploration in Watchmen of why people actually would put on costumes and go out adventuring.
It tries to subvert the idea of what someone who was actually attempting to be heroic is like.
It's actually rather hard to imagine a genuine, grounded person doing that, and what would motivate a person to do that. And it explores that in so many ways, and the answers are not necessarily savory about why someone would do that.
It goes through all the variations of why would you put a costume on? Why would you want to fight crime? Would you be, slightly mad? Would you be altruistic? What would happen if you got superpowers and you couldn't care less, which is kind of Dr. Manhattan,
Your privacy and your ability to have a normal relationship, your ability to have a normal job, all the things that we take for granted. They sacrifice that for justice or something like that. And what does that do to you? Does that make you crazy? Does it make you a recluse? Does it make you lose touch with humanity? These are all the questions that Watchmen asks.
And the notion of the loss of innocence is a big theme in the novel. It's not by accident that they're middle-aged.
In a lot of cases that they're actually slight failures, these characters. They were more heroic 10 years ago. They sat out with great ideals, and now they've kind of become compromised.
Being a superhero wasn't necessarily so super.
He became angry, psychotic, impotent, self-doubting in ways he never had been before. They tore down the idea of the hero, and the funny thing is, when they were done, the heroes seemed realer than ever, and we sort of loved them even more.
How does one be heroic in a very complicated world?
We can save this world.
It's 1985, it's post-Vietnam. It is the point in American history that is post-idealism, where as a culture, as a country, as a world, we're no longer capable of looking at things in black and white.
And I think maybe that's why people like Rorschach so much, because he lives by his own code, and it's very black and white. There's good and there's evil, and evil must be punished. And I think the notion as an audience is that that's pretty good. Yeah.
He wants to see the world as an orderly place, and he's determined to do that, fatally so. And I think we all want to do that, and we all fail continuously. He sort of stands for this longing we all have to see things in terms of good and evil. And of course, that's how earlier superheroes always behaved, more or less, where they knew what was good and what was bad, and who was a hero and who was a villain. Rorschach thinks he does, which is why he's so completely tortured, because the real world, which is what I think we encounter in Watchmen, presents everybody with choices that are just impossible choices. Choices where good and evil can't be untangled.
What is a good guy? Who are the good guys? What does that even mean?
This is all bullshit.
The comedian kind of gets it. He's like, none of this really matters, man. We're all doing this because we have to, but it's not like we're helping.
I can never tell when you're joking.
Watchmen. That's the real joke.
We can't sit at home, but we're not really going to improve the world. The world is an enormous place. For most people, it's entertainment. And I suppose to some extent they must accept that because they dress up in costumes.
Ultimately, he wants to do good, and he wants to, I think, have friends, have relationships. I think he's just clumsy at it. He doesn't have people skills at all. Absolutely a bull in a china shop.
Watchmen doesn't try to answer the question of who's right and who's wrong. It lets the reader decide.
Unable to unite the world by conquest, Alexander's method, I would trick it, frighten it towards salvation with history's greatest practical joke. That's what upset the comedian when awareness of my scheme crashed in upon him. Professional jealousy. Blake's murder, you confess? Confession implies penitence. I merely regret his accidental involvement.
These masked vigilantes, are they doing the right thing? Are they just as bad as the villains that they're trying to catch?
Just because I'm wearing that doesn't mean
I think that we all think, oh, wouldn't it be great for someone to take matters into their own hands, or, you know what, the court system takes too long and too many people get off, and really, like, someone should just go in there and crime bust.
But at the same time, the more rational part of us is saying that it's not one person's responsibility. No one person should have the authority to do that.
Who decides whose morality is correct, you know?
Who are these assholes to say when doomsday approaches? I say when doomsday is approaching.
Abuse of power is a strong theme throughout Watchmen. Not just actually the superheroes, but I think it's even bigger than that, where we have a President Nixon at the time, because the superhero is American and basically the government controls him, he actually takes those powers and uses Dr. Manhattan to change term limits. So he gives himself more power.
The sense of power and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So you have to do something about it and limit it.
Killing millions.
To save billions. A necessary crime.
You know, we can't let you do that.
Do that, Rorschach? I'm not a comic book villain.
In regular superhero comics, there's all these characters with all these powers, yet the world that they live in is just the world that we live in. You know, the fact that there is a man with godlike powers walking around seems to have made no difference to people's everyday lives, and that seems very unlikely. I suddenly realized one day, this isn't a superhero story. This is actually a science fiction story. This is an alternate history. This is, what if somebody had the powers of a god? What would the world be like?
We repeat, the Superman exists, and he is American.
Once I thought about it like that, I didn't even draw it as if it was a superhero story. I didn't want to draw it that way. I wanted to draw it as if it was an alternate history. In which case, all the background things, all the buildings, the forms of transport, the fashions, the fads, immediately become what the story's about.
If those characters had existed in a world where there were superheroes and regular people, how would that change the course of that world's history?
What does it do to religion? What does it do to politics? What does it do to just society having the super being live among us?
Now, if you begin to feel an intense and crushing feeling of religious terror at the concept, don't be alarmed. That indicates only that you are still sane.
It put the ideas of costume adventurism, superheroes, and comic books within a reality which I actually lived in, dealing with New York City, dealing with a political climate that I could relate to.
Those were the years of Ronald Reagan here in America, of Margaret Thatcher in England, and a lot of right-wing conservative politics.
The threat is relatable. The idea that two massive countries would stockpile weapons and could have them pointed at one another with nothing but a push of a button between total annihilation. Those ideas loom larger than almost anything fictitious a writer could make up.
Take us to DEFCON 1.
Great sci-fi is able to deconstruct our world. You know, it holds up a mirror to us. You know, you see in that world the relevant messages of our own.
Breathtaking. John, what about the war? You've got to prevent it. Everyone will die. And the universe will not even notice.
You see, it's a world like ours, but not like ours. And that concept of heroes as though they were real in the real world has become a very common theme in comics. Many people have played with it since then.
I'm sure that Alan had discovered the quote about Einstein saying that he wished he had been a watchmaker, and thought, oh, well, that's the perfect occupation for John's father. And of course, then when you see the whole thing about Watchmen, when you also realise that it is about time, it's watches, you know, watch in the sense of a timepiece. So the theme of the whole book is about time and about the passage of time. And when we get to the episode that deals with Dr. Manhattan, with John Osterman, it's all about hopping backwards and forwards in time and seeing time as just a continuum which always exists.
Making time fluid was just was such a natural way of telling the story of the Watchmen. They become fully dimensional characters because you actually knew their history, and the history was the flashback, and the flashbacks like crossed over with like the flash forward, and then it's like, you know, they were just like parallel scenes running on Mars and then in Manhattan. So you can flick back, it's like check that scene, it's like, you know, go forward again. And yeah, it is quite conceptually different to anything else that had certainly been written at that particular time.
The fact that the story moves backwards and forwards in time does give the characters a richness, and you don't have to say very much to give a great deal of depth, and that's what Alan did so expertly.
The structure of Watchmen is something that I don't think anybody is ever going to fully unravel. I've talked to Dave Gibbons about it, and even he looks at this thing that he made and is baffled by its complexity. All these little things that connect together, the tiniest little scraps of lines and details and throwaway words. What they loved about comic books is that you can page backwards and forwards in them at will. The richness, you can always go back and delve down to a deeper level. I think that's partly what Dr. Manhattan's about. He experiences time backwards and forwards. He moves through it more or less at will. And that's what the reader is when you read a comic book.
If only you could perceive time as I do.
With Watchmen, each time you do it, it means something slightly different.
It was extraordinarily thought out and executed, and set a standard on those levels that perhaps hasn't been equaled.
And action, Dolly! Action! Flash 1! Flash 2! See, that was nice. Like that one.
The Watchmen movie has been a thing that's been mooted for many, many years, kind of 20 years, I guess, at least, and it's been through, I don't know how many directors, producers, studios and things. But I think actually that has been a good thing, because just as when it came along in the world of comics and kind of deconstructed the things that everybody was familiar with, I think now the general movie-going public is very familiar with the kind of idea of comic book heroes and the conventions of the field, you know, and the kind of classic themes. And I think that now in the movies it can be taken to pieces and people will understand actually what the thing that's being deconstructed means.
Bring up the rain! Bring up the rain.
There's some parallels with this book that was written 20-some-odd years ago that ring it really true today and where we are now as a society and as the world.
We live in the Watchmen world, even maybe more so than 1985.
The energy crisis or abuse of power, you know, in the presidency.
Watchmen itself was sui generis, and people look to it then and look to it now as something that really heralds all the possibilities of creating a work of art in comic book pages.
I've always been interested in things that are heightened and that can give us a perspective that can reflect back something very real. In truth, we are exaggerated. whether it is heightened and there's a blue man and there are superheroes and there are, you know, masked crime fighters in the 1940s and all of those things, they are still issues that we can all relate to, about people trying to find themselves and find their place in society and find the way to change the world, and how is that possible? And those are sort of endless questions. Those are questions you can continuously ask yourself.
Superheroes as a concept are vigilantes using their morality to make a judgment about someone else. Who watches the Watchmen is thematic. Who guards the guarders or who polices the police? Who decides whose morality is correct?
Look, Rorschach and I have made real headway on the gang problem by working together.
We can do so much more. We can save this world. It doesn't take a genius to see the world has problems.
Yeah, but it takes a room full of morons to think they're small enough for you to handle.
To take justice into your own hands, we're coming into a term which is known as vigilantism.
It generally happens in response to some sort of perceived threat to a community or some sort of sense that things are spinning wildly out of control.
I'm tired of being afraid. Afraid of war. Afraid of the mass killer.
This isn't a superhero story. This is an alternate history. This is what if somebody had the powers of a god? What would the world be like?
Of course, Watchmen is a product of its time. And at the time when it came out, I think it seemed that one of the major civil liberties issues of the future would be people acting on their own, vigilantes and other independent, non-governmental actors.
It was 1985. The crime was out of control. They were robbing, they were stealing, they were selling drugs in every corner. Crack was coming out.
And you would have to literally go through a phalanx of these thieves and robbers and modern-day terrorists who would dominate whole areas of a city, a neighborhood, a street, a subway, a bus. And so you had to constantly watch your back. And you knew you were on your own.
New York City, in certain places, you really took your life in your hands just walking a city block back then.
Back in the 80s, there was this real sense, I remember as a kid, that, oh, crime's out of control, things are getting worse.
It looks like the set from Escape from New York. You know, there's just smoke and rubble and armed gangs roaming the streets.
It's a funny thing that should have happened in the 80s, because, of course, the great vision of the 80s, Orwell's vision, was one of a police state where everybody was monitored all the time. The reality was very different. You were faced rather with an impotent state, a vanishing state, and the constant threat of riot and crime.
You see what takes place in the streets. You see anarchy. You see the breakdown of respect. You see there's no code of conduct. The philosophy of the guardian angels and what I tell all people is you've got to do something. On the first patrols, people were terrified of us. They saw young blacks, Hispanics, Asians, whites. We would get onto the car of the train, and they would immediately exit stage left as quickly as their feet could carry us, And 5-0, the police were hell-bent on locking us up and throwing away the key. I mean, in the first few years, I got arrested 76 times myself.
Oh, you gotta join the gang, and the gang in my neighborhood were terrorizing the neighborhood. I didn't want to be a part of a gang that was terrorizing the neighborhood. I want to be the good guy.
When you were a teenage boy, you loved those guys. They didn't wait around for some kind of nanny state to take care of them. And they could kick ass like a criminal, except they weren't criminals, they were good guys.
We're physically trained. We must risk our life to stop a crime in progress. An average citizen, if they don't feel they're physically capable, must make noise, must make attention, must try to rally up the other citizens, even if it's from a safe distance. But you have to do something other than just call 911. To me, that is so weak. That is basically waving the flag of surrender, telling the criminals, if the police aren't around, you own this part of town.
If they take it upon themselves, instead of what they should do is call 911 and say, I think I'm observing a domestic disturbance, can the police come? And the police are just held to a higher standard of responsibility and accountability, which these individuals aren't.
It's a complicated subject. It's not something that can be, answered with a yes or no. It is not white or black. And for somebody to say that you always get involved, well, these are people that are not highly trained. Well, I take martial arts and I do this. All the martial arts aren't going to help you in the world if I have a 45.
We've taken down armed gunmen. We've taken down individuals who were firing weapons at the time. We've also, though, buried 6 guardian angels in the line of duty who were shot and killed or stabbed in the line of duty and then unfortunately gave their most precious gift, their life.
I know it sounds corny, and I'm sorry, but I feel like I'm getting ready to do something. A lot of the guys feel quite pumped up when they throw on the uniform. Makes them feel like they're doing something important, something special.
Rorschach's Journal, October 12th, 1985. This city's afraid of me. I've seen its true face. The streets are extended gutters, and the gutters are full of blood. And when the drains finally scab over, all the vermin will drown. The accumulated filth of all their sex and murder will foam up around their waists. And all the whores and politicians will look up and shout, "Save us."
We accept in comic books that you put a costume on and go out into the night and fight crime, but really, why would you put a costume on? How would you fight crime? Would you just be a kind of an altruistic do-gooder, or would you have some other motive or some psychological flaw that made you do it?
Attention citizens, we are trying to maintain order. You must clear the streets until the police strike is over.
Superheroes are self-appointed authorities. These people are helping us most of the time, but what if someday they decide not to?
Our characters go out and again think they're doing really great things, but I think the comedian is a great example. When he's trying to control the riots, he ends up really beating up a lot of the people and then shooting them with rubber bullets. How far is too far?
How long can we keep this up?
Congress is pushing through some new bill that's gonna outlaw masks. Our days are numbered. Till then, it's like you always say, we're society's only protection.
Their, I guess, morality and their beliefs driving their behavior and getting them to vigilante, I think started to create disdain amongst the people.
You want my rights! You are not the law! We want regular cops, no more vigilantes!
They're all fundamentalists in a way. They see a threatening world where their only recourse is to take matters into their own hands.
What do you suggest we do about it?
Retribution.
Watchmen are over.
Says Tricky Dick.
Says me.
They're actually slight failures, these characters. They were more heroic 10 years ago. They sat out with great ideals, and now they've kind of become compromised.
They didn't really have superpowers. They were just dudes wearing costumes. And it makes you think really, really hard about questions of ethics and morality in a way that we're sort of not used to, but Watchmen really forces us to.
They're criminals. They had intentions to commit crime. They should have realized there's a potential price to pay. They ran into the wrong guy at the wrong time.
If you think back, Bernard Goetz, the New York City vigilante, he really loomed large in the public consciousness. He was this enormously polarizing and to some really compelling figure.
It began on December 22nd, 1984, when 4 black youths approached the electronics expert on a subway and, according to Goetz, surrounded him and planned to rob him. He shot all 4 and escaped from the subway, but later surrendered to police.
When Bernard Goetz was the talk of the town 2 years ago, most of the talk proclaimed him hero. But now that the so-called subway gunman is on trial for attempted murder, it appears the tide of public opinion has turned against him.
Some people thought of him as a thug, an example of white rage gone amok. And some people thought of him as a private citizen who took justice into his own hands when the police wouldn't or couldn't do it.
Look at a case, and there are precipitory factors to that case. And they say, look, this guy knew that by arming himself, he had the ability to take someone's life. He knew that by going into this situation, he was probably going to confront these individuals. He knew that when he used this verbiage, this wordage, when he caused these certain types of actions, he knew what was going to transpire. In other words, you're setting up the people. If you don't think that's going to come out in a court case, then you're sadly mistaken.
In English common law, there is a belief that before you use deadly force, you need to first show that you tried to retreat, that you had a duty to retreat. In American legal tradition, that doesn't really exist. And certainly as it's evolved into the 20th and 21st centuries, we've even gone further the other direction, where it is, we're to the point now where it's, if you feel like you're threatened, you can strike back with deadly force.
Jury apparently believed Goetz as they found him innocent on all charges except the illegal possession of the .38 caliber revolver he used. Again and again he heard the words, "not guilty."
I think he did right. He himself admitted that he set out to kill them.
And there was something incredibly strange and just fascinating and repellent about him. Somebody who was thinking about right and wrong. He was thinking about his own ass as well, but he was thinking about right and wrong and acting on it outside the protective cloak of a badge or any kind of institutional sponsorship.
I don't think he's guilty.
Why not?
Because he didn't really do anything wrong.
Now, eventually, it's going to be open season on anybody.
You want to know about Rorschach? I'll tell you about Rorschach.
Rorschach, when he looks at the world, he sees everything in right or wrong. He does see himself as having this mission, sort of like Batman does, of eradicating evil, but Rorschach takes it a lot further. He assumes a lot more responsibility on his part. I mean, Batman catches criminals and then he gives them to the police. Okay, he doesn't torture them, he doesn't kill them. Rorschach, on the other hand, uses a lot more extreme means to get what he wants.
Edgar William Jacoby, also known as Edgar William Bond, also known as Moloch. What are you talking about? I'm a retired businessman.
He's looking to simplify this world into black and white. For him, that complexity makes no sense.
It's funny that he's probably the most beloved character within the Watchmen world. But at the same time, he's probably the most psychotic.
They have this romanticized version of Rorschach because he lives by his own code.
Because you want him to do harm to all those predators in society that you live vicariously through him. And you recognize he's going too far.
We're disgusted by his methods, but at the same time, if these are truly evil people he's doing it to, the little bit inside us that we may not want to recognize is going, yes.
You've watched this whole movie, you've watched, the bad guy do all these horrible things, and all you want to do is just see him dead. Like it's almost like you want to jump through the screen and kill him yourself.
Men get arrested. Blocks get put down.
Even in devoting his life to that, the police don't like him. Citizens don't like him. None of the watchmen like him.
Good joke. Everybody laugh. Roll on snare drum. Curtains.
Through the 19th century, there are various examples you can find of vigilantism. Scholars will say that there is a noticeable uptick in violence after the Civil War. The Civil War teaches people that if you believe a certain thing, then you just use force to achieve it.
In the U.S., we typically have what we call the Trans-Mississippi West era, which most of us would refer to as the Old West.
In Missouri, literally the United States ends right there. They are so far on the edge of nowhere that there simply isn't any law enforcement.
We have now come into a modern era where you have laws throughout the United States. You have court systems throughout the United States.
There's an inherent distrust in the ability of the state, the government, what have you, to enforce the laws and to bring appropriate punishment where it's deserved.
Because what the vigilantes got, which they haven't got, is raw power. The power to deal out justice instantly.
Let me use the Baldknobbers example. They were concerned that the government in the county was corrupt. And so they actually were attacking supporters of the government. At one point they said that this is a battle between barbarism and civilization. I would say in a vigilante situation, you have to have this kind of us versus them mentality. You have to be able to say, those people, okay, or the other. There has to be a distance of some kind.
There's a long history of vigilantism that is not well received by many because there's racial implications. Are you a homophobe? Are you a sadist? Why do you want to be cast in that light?
We were all attempting through our personal efforts to make our country a better and a safer place to live.
Clearly, Hollis Mason is a man who makes no apologies for the life he's lived or the decisions he's made. But is his own personal moral code enough justification for donning a mask and dispensing vigilante justice?
My primary mission in life is to protect the innocent and defenseless. And especially at this time in this world, with all the evil going on, all the wars going on, all the crime going on, that's why there's superheroes popping up everywhere. We're standing up for what we believe in.
The city is now a cesspool of vileness and needs expunged. There's so many people that turn a blind eye to what goes on around them. It makes me sick. And that's exactly why I'm doing what I'm doing.
Well, every kid, even in the worst of circumstances, even in a completely dysfunctional family, would like to be a superhero. But boy, that idealism, that degree of hero worship that overtakes you when you're so young can be knocked the hell out of you.
I was beaten a lot as a kid, and that motivated me to want to protect other people from living through that kind of stuff. I realized I could do a lot of good in this world protecting people, and that helped me understand my calling in life.
I was influenced heavily by my grandfather. He unfortunately was murdered out in front of his own house, and that's what really gave me the wake-up call to do what I'm doing today. So I've taken my personal vendetta, my revenge, my spite, my hate, my fueled anger, and I've bottled it into pure light.
I can understand the emotional and visceral satisfaction that one might get out of that. I understand that, but there are a number of different things that people have to be aware of. One, if it's a matter of going out and preventing crime, that's great. If it's a matter of being good witnesses, that's great. You can find yourself in a vigilante atmosphere getting in over your head, finding yourself in a situation that maybe at the outset you thought was one way, but upon further and complete investigation could be diametrically opposed to what you initially perceived it to be in the first place.
It depends on the situation. If I see someone being attacked, I'm going to take that person. I'm going to throw them off them like I've done before, and I'm going to kick their ass, tell the other person to get away and call the cops. It's time to take action. That's what we need to do. The police can't be everywhere.
We step above that letter of the law. We don't have all that red tape that they have to go through. We're not bound by guidelines and rules like they are.
I mean, we do have a tradition of citizen arrest. You know, we do have neighborhoods that organize patrols and neighborhood watches, and these individuals are just taking it a little further, and they're doing it usually by themselves instead of an organized community effort.
I have never seen a costumed vigilante, although I understand that they do exist. All I can say about them is if those people were inspired in some way by Watchmen, I don't know if they really understood it. Possibly they didn't get to the end.
Some people have a very romantic notion of swooping in to save the damsel in distress, so to speak, and you can find yourself losing everything as a result. So I can come across a person, and I think that I'm going to be the hero because I'm dressed up in a cape and everything else. Well, I got a guy here that just got out of the joint. He's got a joint build, knows what he's doing, and he doesn't care, and the next thing you know, you're dead.
Even with the very best of intentions, you could find yourself in some situations where you might be causing more problems than you were solving.
If I die in this line of work, I can actually die thinking that I've completed something.
There's a romanticism to vigilantism in Hollywood, but there is absolutely nothing romantic about an autopsy.
When I hear about people doing this, I think, you know, that's actually a good thing to an extent.
So what you're looking at here is just some of the equipment. This is by no means all of it that we not only train individuals in, that we have to learn how to operate. It kind of gives you a visual of what it takes in order to confront actual suspects out there that might be armed. You go in and you confront somebody and you think you have the situation under control, and suddenly, because suspects act in a very extemporaneous fashion, they can suddenly go from literally 0 to 60 in a fraction of a second, and you have to respond accordingly. But there are also bounds that you have to operate within. And unless you're a trained professional, most people don't know what those bounds are.
It would take a superhero to stay morally staunch as a vigilante, and I've never met one.
Certainly we've had instances of police officers going too far, but they're investigated and they're disciplined if appropriate. No one's saying the system is perfect, but there are internal affairs departments that police do police themselves.
I mean, you sort of hope if you're a cop that all the cops out there are doing the same thing, fighting the same battles, with the same sense of morality, the same code, and that's just not the way it happens. I guess you're part of a big fraternal order of police, but there's extortion, and there are good cops, and there are bad cops.
I got to tell you, the temptations out there, particularly once you've established your credibility, are being thrown at you fast and furiously. It's like you're a rock star. It's like you're a rap star. And then you need to control your humongous ego because you need a crane to get it in and out of the room. And then that's when you decide to do things that you know are morally wrong and legally wrong. I must be right. I'm a guardian. I'm the one that people are depending on. And then that's when you begin to take advantage of it.
I'm anonymous for the times that I don't stay within the law. No one wants to be corrupt. No one wants to admit that corruption is rampant, but it is. There's a monster in everyone.
My allegiance is not to the law. My allegiance is to what is morally right.
I would contend vigilantism seldom turns out well. The moment at which you take a large step and a frequent step outside the legal, the normal legal realm, it's not long before, you've joined the criminals yourself. So, and you begin to do things and see yourself as bigger and above the law.
And that's what I've found with all vigilantes. They occupy a really dark and terrifying place.
What is it that someone does that makes them a hero? And are those things always as cut and dry and easy as they are in the movies?
There probably are people out there in the community who do heroic things, but who don't dress up, who don't announce themselves. I think that would probably be my definition of a real-life superhero.
It's not one person's responsibility. No one person should have the authority to do that, and that's who Watches the Watchmen comes from, is if we have these self-appointed vigilantes going out and not just catching criminals, but they are appointing themselves as judge, jury, and executioner, or punisher, and that's the who watches the watchmen. If we appoint guardians or self-appointed guardians, who's going to guard them? Who's going to watch them?
When you have somebody who, and whether it's a vigilante, a superhero, or anybody who exercises power over another person, our natural assumption as sheep-like human beings is that person must be right. If they're exercising authority, they must be entitled to it. But the reality is there is no ground. There's just it's kind of an infinite regress of moral ambiguity. And the answer is nobody watches the Watchmen.